Hi, this is Zach with Worn and Wound, and today we're taking a look at the Hamilton Intra-Matic 68 Auto Chrono. So this is a watch that they brought out at Basel World 2017. We actually got to see it a few months before that in January at a Basel World preview, and it's caused quite the stir, both positive and negative, in the watch world. It's a watch that I think a lot of people were really excited to see Hamilton come out with. It refers back to a series of chronographs they made in the 60s and 70s that are really popular and have gained a lot in value over the last few years, sometimes referred to as poor man's Carreras. They're basically, as you can see here, twin register chronographs. They had various different value hand-wound movements in them, as well as one model, which I happen to have the luck of owning, which had the caliber 11 movement in it, which was called the Chrono-Matic. So they kind of took a mix of these different watches from the 60s and 70s and made it, something that's in the spirit of all of them to some respect, and yet isn't a replica of any one in particular. So you won't find to my knowledge, actually, this sort of cream-colored tachometer with the black center and then the panda eyes. There's usually panda eyes in black, and there's a lot of different variations, but this exact one might not have existed previously. So people were really excited to see it. I was very excited to see it. But then the controversial side of it is that they made the watch quite a lot larger than the originals. So making it larger than the originals, totally to be expected. Those are like 36 millimeter watches. Not something you're going to find on the market too often, especially considering the movements that are available today. So this is, he's a modern movement, the Hamilton Caliber H31, which is based on the Valjoux 7750 series of movements. It's an automatic chronograph, so it's thick. And they made the watch 42 millimeters. And 42 is big. It is, there's no way around that. It is a sizable watch. It is significantly larger than the originals. Would 40 have been tamer? Yes. Would 38 have been maybe a sweet spot? Perhaps, but they have to answer to a much larger market, and they play off what is going to kind of work across the board and not just for the watch enthusiast crowd. So 42 millimeters it is, and that is not outlandish for a modern chronograph by any means. And I think in some ways they did a really good job of playing at that size. So just to get right into it, looking at the dial is really the star of the show here. I'll get the chronograph running. So you have this inverse panda dial, black center, sort of a cream-colored registers here and a cream-colored tachometer. I really like that they didn't do crisp white there. That gives it just a little bit of the sort of tropical aged feeling. At the same time, it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like fake patina. And you'll notice that the lume plots on here, such as on these applied markers and on the hands, are just white lume. They didn't do any kind of vintage tritium lume. So not going for that kind of like costume jewelry vintage look. They're just playing off of that aesthetic style, and just the color choices I think were really smart. And the proportions of this dial work really well, in my opinion. I've seen some people argue the other way, but to me they did a really good job of this. So obviously you have this dual register chronograph layout, really classic chronograph layout, active seconds at 9, 30-minute counter at 3. They made those sub-registers really big. And I love that. I personally just think sub-dials, it works, depends on the watch, but I like them when they're really large. I definitely prefer them to be really large than small. Small to me always looks kind of like something's beady-eyed and kind of, staring out at me in a way I don't like. But this I feel like works really nicely. And then just the proportions of how that sits then, the distance from that to the edge of the tachometer, you have that one little lume plot there. It feels like everything was really precisely, figured out. And that's the kind of thing that is most important to me. You don't have any odd gaps. You don't have anything being cut off or, feeling squashed by the subdials. They all work really nicely. And furthermore, once again, that's based on the movement. So the movement, the subdials are fixed, if you will. They have this movement, they have to put the subdials where they are, and then they have to size everything around that. Similarly, you have the date at 6 o'clock. And I think they did a really good job of this. This actually looks very similar to what's on the Hamilton Chronomatic, which we'll show you side by side of that in a bit. And once again, it's really the distance that, to me, that matters a lot on this. So, imagine if that window, if the watch had been smaller, that window would stay the same place. So suddenly it'd be cutting up against the tachometer, let's say. Or if it got bigger, which they definitely wouldn't do, it could be floating away. So I think that's landed right where it should land. And those elements combine to make the dial feel just really taut and well balanced. And it's a very attractive dial. All the little elements look great. The applied indices have nice little facets on them. The lume looks good. It glows decently. I think it's just, very, very successful in that regard and very attractive. Certainly one of the most, I think, attractive sort of like vintage, non-military style Hamilton watches that they've come out with in some time. Looking at the case of the Intra-Matic 68 Auto Chrono, it is definitely large, and while the proportions of the dial I think came out really, really well, the case has some issues, for me at least. So 42 millimeters to the side of the cylindrical center, slab sides, very straightforward design, and that does stay true to the original watches, which were very kind of very linear and had just very faceted shapes on them. Then you have 50.22 millimeter lug to lug length, so that gets long. And while it definitely is visually representative of the original, I do find that this is where it might get a little bit uncomfortable on the wrist because it spans over the top of the wrist so much. Next, it is 14.8 millimeters tall, which there's no way around it. I mean, that is certainly a tall watch. It's nearly 15 millimeters. That is in line with many, modern automatic chronographs. So I wasn't surprised to see that, but I, obviously would have preferred a thinner watch. But here's where the proportions get a little funny, and I think, they might have made a little bit of a, not a mistake, but I think this could have been a little bit better thought out. So you have this mid case here where you have these faceted lugs coming off of it, and then you have this really big bowl-shaped case back. And what happens is that the lugs are a little bit higher than that case back. So when it's on your wrist, it sits very high. And basically there's like a gap that forms between your wrist and the watch. And I personally found that on my wrist to be a little bit uncomfortable and just a little bit awkward. It kind of makes the watch somewhat top heavy. Ways around that, I think probably could have been making this mid case a little bit thicker, playing, once again, it's really playing with those proportions. Something that I truly would have loved to see on this watch, and I understand why they wouldn't have done it, is made it manual wind. I mean, that's a lot to ask, obviously, from the brand, but if this had been a manual wound version of the movement, I mean, it is a limited edition after all, that could have cut down maybe, a millimeter or two, which I think would have had a positive effect on the overall wearability of the watch. While still on the case, you have a big screw down crown here, big vintage style pump pushers, those look great. It's entirely polished all around. Once again, that is true to the original, but something that I think could have been played with a little bit. There are some spots here that would have, I think, done really nice with some brushing. Because it's all polished, I did find it kind of picked up some fingerprints, etc. On this side of the watch, you'll notice a depressed pusher that is used to change the date on the H31 movement. That's true across basically all the modern Hamilton chronographs. You'll find that. Nothing offensive there, though. I don't know if that's really the most necessary thing to have when it could have been put in the crown, but that's a conversation for another day. Case back, solid case back. So, that refers to the fact that those manual wound watches, and frankly any watches from the 60s, 70s, were not going to have display case back. So I think that's a little bit of a nod to that history. They put a nice little Hamilton pattern here. Having seen some really elaborate case backs in the last couple of years from brands ranging from under $500 to $5,000, I think something a little bit more could have been done here. Maybe a little bit something that spoke to the history of the watch, something like that. But it is the case back, so it isn't a deal breaker at all to have something a little bit boring. So here's a bit of an unfair comparison, admittedly, but since we had access to the watch, figured we'd show it to you. So this is the Hamilton Chronomatic from 1969, which, as I said, I happen to have the luck of owning. I've had it for several years, and it's a fairly rare watch. They've gone up in value quite a bit. What's really kind of exotic about it is that it has the caliber 11 movement, which was most notably used by Heuer and Breitling, and it was developed as one of the first automatic chronographs, kind of jointly between those two brands and Buren, but Hamilton bought a controlling interest in Buren, and then Hamilton had access to those movements and used them fairly minimally for a few years, but this was one of the watches that they came out with. So it took basically that style from those earlier Valjoux hand-wound movements and then added that automatic functionality, and obviously you have the interesting kind of left-right crown situation here. And you can see obvious similarities between the two, but then obvious differences. So the applied indices on this model really refers to most of the hand-wound models, but you have the date on both of them, which I think, like I said, I really like the date on the new one, how they did the outline on it. You can see how there's an outline here. And then you have the inverse tachometer on both of these, even though these watches are mirror color-wise from each other. One thing I do really actually like about the original was it was an applied tachometer, so that it had a layer up. Here, the dial is actually domed, so the tachometer sort of recedes back away from you a little bit. It doesn't really affect usage or anything like that, not that anyone's using tachometers that often, but I kind of like the layered look of the original just a hair more. But then you also see nice things like the Hamilton logos are the same on both of them. So you have the vintage Hamilton logo here. Here it said Chronomatic, and here it says Automatic. I think those are just nice little similarities. But you can obviously see, as we mentioned, much more upscaled. This one was it's about 35 millimeters, 35, 36, and then 42. But you can see the proportions really kind of work. In some ways, actually, the proportions of the subdials on here might be a tiny bit better than the proportions of the subdials on the older model. But I still I'll keep my older model for now. So on the wrist, I think there's a mix of really good things and some things that aren't quite as good. The dial, I think, like I said, it looks really good. It's nicely proportioned, and it feels nice on my wrist at this size. It's got a nice boldness to it. Everything's very clear. It's easy to read at a glance. Looking at this watch on other people's wrists, which I've done, I felt like it had a nice presence to it. But then the case itself is just a little bit big. The lug to lug is long and straight. Like I said, it doesn't curve down very much. So you get a bit of this kind of plain over the wrist feel to it. And then, as I said, there's like kind of a gap underneath, and that just makes it feel a little bit top heavy, a little wobbly, and not a deal breaker at all. And I think different people are going to find this fits them differently. The wrist shape, I think, is going to play a big role here. So I have a 7-inch wrist, but I feel like it's actually this distance on top, or from side to side, that might matter more than even the diameter of your wrist here. So if you had a wider wrist, this would sit a little bit better on your wrist and not have as much of that opportunity to kind of wobble a bit. But either way, I mean, it's a great looking watch, and I think kind of get caught up in some of those, other aspects of it. And I think, it's a lot of fun. It looks great. Different straps, I think, are going to really bring out different aspects of it. This is a 22 millimeter black sort of faux rally strap, if you will. I call it faux because these holes are perforations on a top layer of leather. They might even be indentations, to be honest. They don't penetrate through, so that, to me, makes it not a true rally. I understand the look of it. I don't love it, but it's a comfortable strap. It has actually a nice buckle on it. It's padded. I think a distressed brown leather could have played off the, some of the vintage inspirations a little bit more. While I'd be hesitant to say to make it taller by putting a nylon strap on there, I think that could maybe actually make it hold down to the wrist a little bit better, which could be nice. And then actually maybe something like a Milanese or a beads of rice style metal bracelet could look very cool as well. And that's just watches like this that you can really kind of play with the overall feeling by changing the strap. I think in the end become more versatile and easier to wear. So to just kind of wrap up quickly, I think the Hamilton did a good job in some respects, could have maybe done a little bit better in some others, but overall made a very fun watch, a very attractive watch, a watch that I think a lot of people are going to be really into. It is a limited edition, so it has collectability potentially associated with it. There's, I believe, 1,968 are being made, and it has a retail price of $2,195. That's MSRP, and that is totally in line with a Swiss-made automatic chronograph by Hamilton. No surprises there. I was glad to see it wasn't disproportionately more expensive for being limited or being newer or something like that. So price is fair, and that's MSRP, so it'll likely be a little bit less when you actually find one. Please read the full review on Worn and Wound. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.